So one way to make drawing objects a lot easier is by using sighting techniques in order to locate your object. It's a lot easier to find how to position an object and put it into proportion if you have something to compare it to, something like a line or something that you can relate it to and compare ratios and proportions. So one way artists do that is by creating what are called axis lines, construction lines as you draw. So by literally drawing these lines in your drawing, these help you, like, these kind of marks are similar to the underlying skeleton of a building, like the I-beams and the framing before you add the walls and the plumbing and electricity and the roof. And so when drawing, you can also use lines that don't have to be permanent and you can keep them there as long as you need while you place everything you need. And one of these lines is, I think, axis lines. So if you have an object and it turns and rotates, I like to imagine that there's something in the very dead center of every single object. So take this light bulb, for example. Imagine that there is something running right through the center. You can also think of like an apple's core. Generally an apple, unless it's asymmetrical, which most of them are, imagine a spine, a thread going right down the center. Or in many kinds of sculpture, an armature is underlying something. Think of it as the underlying structure that will help strengthen your drawing and help you build your drawing. So it's not bad to have what you might see as extraneous marks in the start, so long as it helps you get to a final drawing. And this, especially when learning how to draw, helps train you to start looking for these things that you might not otherwise think to use. So one type of line is the axis line, but sometimes people call these plumb lines. And so this is my dad's old, my dad was an engineer, and I don't know if this was his or one of his relatives, because I think I have distant stonemason relatives. I have no idea. But anyway, this is a solid, I think, brass plumb line. And this was used by people in order to construct everything from houses to calculating how to build walkways, structures. I don't exactly entirely know. Roadways is what my dad used to help make. And so how architects and builders use this is that they used gravity as a way to create a straight line, a 90-degree line that will tell them what is straight. And so we can, as artists and draftsmen, we can think about lining up. This might not be centered because I'm a little bit farther away. We can imagine a plumb line going through our objects, through the center. And so if we draw this straight line through our objects, that'll help us make sure everything is straight if we want it to be straight. So if you are doing more expressive drawing, this is for trying to learn how to draw very accurately and with correct proportions, which is a good thing to know how to do at the foundations level. If you want to become expressive, I think this is why you want to know that this exists, because one thing you can do when you want to create more expressive drawing later is you can then distort some of these underlying principles. This idea of this straight axis line later on down the road, if you want to play around with exaggerating center lines, for example, making curved axis lines, having an understanding of this line to begin with can help you recreate, if you're drawing representationally or drawing objects to begin with, can help you think about different ways to break the rules later down the road. And so I think of vorticism in Britain. They had a lot of it was an Art Deco movement, and a lot of their style was coming from really embracing curves and exaggerating such things. And so in some ways their work was not straight up and down. Their work had a lot of curves, but I think understanding how to draw things to begin with, thinking about things, how do you make them straight to begin with, then you can kind of curve them around and have fun with that. So the other thing is thinking about 90-degree angles. So you can find the plumb line, the straight up and down line, and then you can also try to put things inside a literal box. And so when making your first drawings, you can imagine, well, what's the proportion of my box? Are they about equal? Which side is longest? Which side is shortest? So I always look for the highest points of my objects, the widest points of my objects, and the lowest points of my objects. And then what I do is do something called extending my lines. Let me go find a black string and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so this might not be a perfect demonstration because it might not line up with the camera. And this is not blacks and it's just gray. But what I want you to think about is, when you think about finding how things relate to one another, you might imagine a straight line going across all of these furthest points of every object. So first imagine putting everything in a box. That'll help you be able to see both sides, might help you to judge proportions. So carry out the highest and lowest points of everything. But you can also extend these lines and points. So you can use tick marks, or you can literally draw very light lines throughout your drawing to help you figure out how do each of these objects relate. So if I extend the baseline straight across, like the bottom of my bottle, where does that hit in the relationship to the rest of my images? So if I were to extend this line in my drawing, I can then use that to figure out where does it hit this other object, or does it go completely over the others? Or if I were to find the top of this, or the top of this, or the top of the box, where does that go? Or, you know, with the plumb lines, extend those beyond your objects. Make the box of the object that you're using to measure things with. But then, if you pull it all the way down to the bottom of your image, where else does that same line hit or cross? And of course, so I mostly end up using verticals and horizontals because those are often the easiest to find. And if you're trying to put your objects inside boxes or rectangles, it's a little easy. But then I usually use the corners of those rectangles, or even sometimes I use the middle of the axis line in the center of an object. So in more elliptical objects, that's like the lowest point. I will find those angles, or I'll use different points on the very edges of my object and draw in those to find angles and proportions. And I'll just draw that entire line on my paper, and later I can lift it up or knock it back so it's not as strong. So what is this angle? Draw it in. And so there's a lot of push and pull that happens in the drawing using this method, especially if you don't have a consistent unit of measure to begin with. So in many ways, this method, all methods of drawing from life, it's a lot more helpful if you have one object that's basically correct and where you need it to start. And then you can kind of do all of these comparisons and work your way out from a single right object. Something I like to do to start is think about, so I know I mentioned placing everything within a box, but one of the first things I do when approaching a drawing is thinking about what is the entire box of what I want to include, and this is where viewfinders come in. So using your viewfinder, you can establish how much you want to include or disclude, and maybe what is the outer points, the outer corners, maybe even the center of your whole drawing. And so sometimes it helps to know maybe where in relationship to your drawing you want to place, say, the very top of this object. Do you want it going off the edge? And by kind of looking at something like a viewfinder in advance and starting by placing, I usually do one of my largest objects, or I often end up doing one of my medium-sized objects. Like I might actually use this as my measurement. This width might be easier to find and locate and compare things with. So I might take this width and try to figure out how tall is my bottle. So how much of this width is the height of this bottle? And so a lot of times it's not like a perfect match. It might be like 4.5 or like 4 2/3. So trying to figure out these proportions, sometimes there is a little bit of error that happens when learning how to do this. And so just be willing to go back and adjust your drawing as you see fit. Let's see what else. And so if I have markings that I'm using for judging that are incorrect, I'll go and lift them out or try to erase them. I try not to erase too much where I can, just because the more you erase, the more you wear down the tooth of the paper. And so a lot of times I wait for big things for erasure later down the road. A lot of times, especially for a value drawing, I'll be building values on top of things. So I might not even need to get rid of a line, but what I can do is go back with another pencil that's either a little bit softer and build up a tone that's a little bit darker, so I know that's the correct one for setting up my drawing. All right, let's try this out. When you draw, you always want to keep your sketchbook parallel in front of you, and if at possible, keep it parallel to your eyes or your face. Something that can often happen is if our sketchbooks are flat, there can often be a slight shift in our proportions that happen from having this tilted away from us. So in order to prevent that, if you can lift this somehow, oftentimes I'll just gather bags or cloth or rolled up t-shirts and stuff it under here so that it'll stay nice and stable. So I'm going to go ahead and do that before I get started. Although what is most easiest and most relaxed, this might cut off in this frame here, is to actually have it propped up on your lap, leaning up against the table. Now I'm slightly tilted, so my concern is that if this is not the same direction, there might be some errors in my drawing, but this might be fine. So it might be easiest just to lean it on your, and put it on your knees, lean it up against the table. Ideally, it's easiest to draw if you back up far enough to like extend your arm, so that it's a lot more easy and natural to draw. And if you're judging proportions in the method I'm going to go through. So if you're judging proportions, it's a lot easier to extend your arm and then bring those measurements and comparisons down to your paper if your arm is straight. So like if you're kind of really up close to your drawing and you're like, oh, let me check the angle, and then you're like, oh, let me move this, there's a lot more room for error and shifts of proportion. So if you can keep your arm out between yourself and your sketch pad, that might be best. I know everybody has a slightly different situation. So if you are like sitting on a ground or a bed or something, rather than something like this, you might grab like a backpack, or I was about to do a method where I stack t-shirts. These are cut up t-shirts. And just kind of prop it up here a little bit. And it's better to have it slightly propped than like completely flat, I think. This is not quite, I want to pack this a little bit more.